So here are some key factors that can lead to a parent being narcissistic or emotionally immature. So a lot of times as a therapist, people ask me, why is my parent like this? How does this even happen? And as a therapist, sometimes it can be difficult not to immediately give a concrete answer. A personality disorder is defined by the DSM-5 as a pervasive personality pattern that is somewhat defined also by cultural norms. It can also be noted that it's long-standing, intensive, and pervasive. And what's important to know is, unlike if you had anxiety or depression, you would be likely to seek help with that. But oftentimes people with personality disorders or who are emotionally immature don't see a problem in their behavior. They may threaten, blame, or have childlike expectations that impact people around them, but they're not necessarily wanting to do anything about it. So let's talk about the reasons why it's likely that this happens. There are a lot of factors. There's biology, there's nurture, there's cultural components, and of course, trauma. Here are the top 2 factors that I'll focus on today. 1, nurture. In other words, how people were raised or parented. Often a narcissistic parent either doesn't have or didn't have many consequences when they were growing up, they could do no wrong, or they may have had a lot of trauma. So the person was really never taught the value of how to consider others or to consider their impact on others' feelings. Think about like if you had a kid, let's say, and they hurt someone's feelings in school, you'd probably want to check in with making your kid talk to the other child and see what they did to hurt their feelings and try to resolve it. Usually a narcissistic or emotionally immature person never had that experience. So here's 2 things we're gonna focus on today. 1 is nurture. In other words, how they were raised or parented. Often if a narcissistic parent became like this, they probably may not have had any consequences, or they could do no wrong, or they had a lot of trauma. So if the person was never taught the value of how to consider other people's feelings, that's definitely something that can create patterns later in life. This is another factor, cultural components. And sometimes we hear in certain cultures that the mother is always right. Matriarchal or patriarchal cultures that basically have the value that the parent can't be questioned can sometimes feed a narcissistic personality. And just a quick disclaimer, although the premise may be useful in childhood or at times where their elders should be respected, there can be problems if there are no limits to this, meaning that no one else's feelings in the family are as important as the mother or the father. So there's no challenging the parent, even when they engage in abusive behavior. And it can really impede closeness. Like if your parent is the boss in the family, how can you really open up to them? And one example we see in like pop culture about this is when you watch the documentary about Prince Harry and when he was dealing with like his queen grandmother before she passed, that you could really tell that because of all the protocols, there was a lot of limits to that closeness. So the other factor is cultural components. Think about it. I'm sure you've heard mother is always right, and certain cultures really emphasize this. Like, for example, my mom is Hispanic, and in her culture, at least her component of the culture, it's very matriarchal. The parent can't be questioned, and that can really at times feed the narcissistic personality. And a quick disclaimer, of course, when you are growing up, there are aspects that you can't question with your parents. That can have a place and time. But we know that when it's taken to the extent that the parent can never be questioned, even if they're engaging in abusive behavior or the parent is always on top, that can also impede a sense of being valued in the family. Because if your parent is like your boss, it's almost impossible to feel closeness to them. I was watching Prince Harry talk about something regarding his queen grandmother prior to her passing away. And I noticed when he talks about all the protocols and all the things he had to do to approach her, I can only imagine that really impeded a sense of just being able to connect with her and get emotional closeness like a grandmother. And I think these cultural components become more pronounced when the child now becomes an adult. And then all of a sudden that dynamic doesn't naturally evolve into the parent giving the adult now more respect. And there are other factors and other examples that could be tied into this, like for example, maybe the narcissistic parent gave the child that's now an adult money to help them with college. But under the surface, a lot of the goals can be to keep them tied to needing them and keep the dynamic going, and can also be really frustrating to the adult child in the situation, because no matter what they do, they can't seem to break that pattern. So those are two things, two components of what can contribute to someone being narcissistic. And there's many more that we'll go into in later videos. So like and subscribe for more, and thank you.